off and disconnect to it, but I'm in conversation with you, so I can't bail tonight. So
Yeah, no, there you are. I mean, you can, yeah, why you can stick around if you want. It sort of keeps me company, and then I
well,
can
someone's got to. If I'm doing conversation, I got to actually be here, right? Unless you're going to just
yeah.
talk for an hour.
And if you have to go and talk, the plumber's already come and gone.
No, he's downstairs snaking the main pipe out, so I don't know how long that's going to take.
Okay,
I'm paying him
okay.
overtime right now. I was joined.
Dwayne.
What was that?
If you
You're being recorded.
Oh, we're ready to go. Okay.
No, you're being recorded. Everything
Okay,
you're
I guess
talking
we should
about.
stop the other chatter then. Okay, we'll wait for Ed to say go.
Yeah. Alrighty,
Let's
we
still
got a
see.
good start here. Why don't you go ahead and get going, Dwayne?
Okay. Good evening, folks. This is Dwayne. I'm a science fiction and fantasy buyer for University Bookstore here in Seattle. Tonight, I am really happy that we are featuring a renowned author and all-around cool guy, William Gibson, who I've been reading since a friend stuffed a copy of Neuromancer in my hand years ago and said I had to read it and wouldn't take no for an answer. And we're here for the celebrate the paperback release of The Agency. And I think Bill wants me to read a little bit first, then we'll do some questions and conversation and get going from there. Okay, take it away, Bill.
okay. Hi everybody. This is chapter 33 of Agency is entitled Clarion Alley. And if you know San Francisco, you've probably been in Clarion Alley because it's like a sort of public museum of super high-end graffiti. Actually, it's more like street murals. I don't know. They're amazing, and this alley's full of them. So, if you haven't read, for those of you who haven't read this book, Verity, the woman who's the protagonist of this thread of the book, is she's in an alternate time track in which something that happened in our time track didn't happen. And I think, when I get to the end of this, you'll realize what it was that didn't happen. Although for some reason, I'm glad I did it, but I'm not really sure why. For some reason, I never mentioned the name of the person who didn't happen in quite the same way. Anyway, you'll see. And Verity is out having a walk with a digital, sort of high-end digital assistant. She's being paid to beta test, and it goes by the name of Eunice. And by chapter 33, Verity's seriously starting to realize that Eunice isn't your average piece of beta software. Anyway, here we go. Verity always enjoyed the murals in spite of the smell of pee, the alley's walls doing double duty as public gallery and casual urinal. But it had been over a year since she'd last been here. Eunice had suggested it after some surprisingly enjoyable aimless wandering, like walking with someone you didn't know very well but found interesting. Arriving at the Valencia Street end, Eunice had seemed to be looking for something. She'd sent one of the drones ahead to find it. And here it was, Verity assumed, midway between Valencia and Mission, on a prime two-story stretch of smooth brick, a celebration of the president's bravery during the campaign, rendered in shiny black and white, like a giant Victorian steel engraving executed by OCD fairies. The president stood smiling, her arms outstretched to America. Her opponent loomed behind her, as he once actually had, Verity herself having watched this debate live. Seeing this now, she recalled her own sickened disbelief at his body language, the shadowing, his deliberate violation of his opponent's personal space. I don't think anyone I know believes there was ever any real chance of him winning, she said now to Eunice. I don't know whether I did myself, but I was still scared shitless of it. She was looking at how the artist had rendered his hands grabby. Smells like piss, Eunice said. You can smell, Verity asked. Eunice's access to a pair of glasses, sort of Google Glass style. You can smell, you can smell. Google says, I wanted to see this one. Eunice said, why? It's a branch plant thing. You want to see the rest? Verity noticed one of the drones now like a displaced black pixel yo-yoing slowly up and down in front of a monochrome mural, recording it, she assumed. Not so much. Where'd you like to go now? 3.7, Eunice said. This is the name of a coffee shop they're headed for. Anybody there, Verity asked. Your favorite barista, said Eunice. Verity started back toward Valencia, past other murals, one of Aztec pyramids covered in monarch butterflies. She glanced up, passing a two-story ferociously maternal Venezuelan goddess, her tits prominently out, holding aloft a human pelvis with both hands. Eunice facially recognized a girl in a surplus parka, headed past them down the alley. You need a rice cooker? She's got one on Craigslist. It's Toshiba. Don't do that, Verity said. It's too personal. You ever ridden bitch on a big bike, Eunice asked? Whoa. That's my cat, Biggles. What's that got to do with rice cookers? Nothing, Eunice said, on the back, getting boob jammed if your biker brakes too hard. More than once, Verity said. Why? A branch plant just asked me, said Eunice. Eddie's got a BMW, Verity said, 73R series, likes to talk about it more than ride it. Know how to hang on, lean curves, keep your feet on the pegs? Basically, Verity said, turning onto Valencia's sidewalk. Okay, that's a taste of its confusing self.
So this is being considered a trilogy in his book too. Do you write them? And when you think of starting this out, do you have a trilogy of novels that link together in mind? Because I know you don't do a typical trilogy anyway, but most of your books now are considered parts of those.
This is a weird exception to the rule. And because when I finished The Peripheral, I thought, well, no second or third books. This is a standalone thing. And the weight of all these alternate time tracks is just, it's too big just too big a task. I don't want to go there. I got away with it in The Peripheral, but so I decided, and I was going to write, and I pitched this, a novel set sort of the year after I wrote it, a novel set in more or less the present in San Francisco. And it was going to be a kind of comic, satirical novel about Silicon Valley billionaires. And so I came up with two characters who are very much like Eunice and Verity. And Eunice is a beta tester of new products. which she is in agency. Rather, Verity is that, and Eunice is sort of a piece of really, really darkly secret Pentagon technology that's been stolen by somebody who's now tried to repackage it as the next super series. And I was going to call that book Tulpagachi, from Tamagotchi, the little, digital pet toys that were around, 15, 20 years ago, maybe more. But tulpa from that sort of theosophical society appropriated from the Tibetan mystics idea that if you're, sufficiently psychically powerful, you can project thought forms of yourself anywhere in the world, and they'll talk to people and everything that people will never realize they're just talking to a tulpa, and it looks like you. So, I was going to make sense of that title, and I like the sound of it and everything. And then Trump happened. Trump got elected, and I woke up the morning after that, and I was having my morning coffee, and I realized that book no longer made any sense emotionally. That even if I could have it written overnight and publish it tomorrow, it would make no sense at all. I knew that it was already, even though I hadn't written it, it was sort of already in a past that we were no longer in. And then what had just happened in the presidential election was, I thought, and I still think I'm right, the single biggest game changer I've seen. I'd seen in my life up to that point. So I was really unhappy about that for a month or more. And then I was thinking about it, and I thought, I liked the book I was working on, but it feels like it's happening in an alternate time track. And I kind of stopped myself and went, whoa, what if it's happening in an alternate time track? And that promptly admitted all of the alternate time track machinery that already exists in the peripheral. And it very quickly fell together for me. It took the form of what it ultimately became, not the whole story. Not the plot part, but it became this other book. And Eunice and Verity is from an alternate time track where Clinton won. But everything's in so Clinton won, but everything else is, exactly as fucked up as it already was. They got the climate thing happening, all the, slowly apocalyptic stuff we're looking at. It's all still going on. Plus they've got some other problems. It looks like there's going to be a nuclear war in the Middle East, and people are wondering if the president can stop it. And well, not to go, no spoilers. So anyway, that's how it became. But what it's had this weird, to address your question a little more. It had this strange effect of making Agency much more a lineal sequel than I've ever written before, because the characters from the peripheral come back. It's that same world, so it is all turning into one big story, I hope. And the volume I'm writing now will conclude it though. And I, I don't know what I'll do after that. I might, I don't know, write a Civil War novel. That sort of tempts me sometimes.
I think most of us would happily visit the alternate timeline where Hillary Clinton won the election. It was pretty shocking to most of the people I know in Seattle and elsewhere. And most folks I hang out with certainly weren't rooting for Trump, but there are people out there that still think he's great. I won't go into that big time. So this is actually kind of like your first real trilogy, because before my impression was always the first book would feature this character as the main character, and then the other characters that were minor characters would take over maybe in book 2, or it would flow around in the same universe and timeline, but it would be different lead characters usually, or some
Yeah,
guy who was like, you know.
I never planned anything to be a trilogy. And actually every time I've started a new book after completing a trilogy, I've been absolutely certain that it would not be the first book in a 3-volume set. I don't know what that's about, but with this one, or rather with the Peripheral, I thought I kind of achieved it. Like I was going, there's no way I can write anything else set in that world, because it's this infinite expanse of worlds. And one thing, to give credit where credit is deeply, deeply due, the rules of time travel in these books weren't mine, or they aren't my invention. They're really quite brilliant, but I didn't invent them. They're from a story by Louis Shiner and Bruce Sterling called Mozart in Mirror Shades. And the mechanism of time travel they imagine simply doesn't have that butterfly effect, rippling back and affecting, rippling back on the future of some tiny event. So there's no, which is beautiful book for writing, because it makes paradox impossible. But
Yeah, I still remember as a kid, reading Ray Bradbury's A Sound Like Thunder, and that had a real impression on me.
Yeah, it really impressed me too. But he was early on, and particularly masterful with it, and just the miles and miles of literary paradox that other people had later brought to that sort of put me off it. And so the Sterling and Shiner, by the Sterling and Shiner rules, as soon as you travel back, and in theirs you can travel physically to the past, and you can't in the books in these trilogy, although you can do it digitally a number of ways. But in the Sterling Shiner version, as soon as anyone goes back, it creates an event that didn't happen in the history of whoever went back. So it forks. And so you can go as the bad guys do in Mozart and Mirror Shades. You can go back to Mozart's day and strip mine Europe and ship the ore, take the ore up to your future without destroying the possibility of 20th century Germany. And it's so clean, and I thought, this is so clean and easy, but it actually did turn out to be quite complicated. But somebody says, actually it's Inspector Ainsley Lowbeer, who some of you will know from the Peripheral, says something like, Well, he didn't get elected in Verity's world, but he didn't get elected in Verity's world, but it doesn't mean they aren't headed into the bandsaw. They are headed into the bandsaw, she says, but at a much less acute angle.
Okay.
You know, like it's
So-
not a very comfortable world. It's hard to imagine, but you know, I spent enough time in it to realize that you know, if Hillary had won, there'd be all kinds of trouble and disaster looming anyway that didn't have anything to do with who was president. But yeah.
So when you start out, you helped found cyberpunk, which may or may not make you happy. Some of the seminal terms were, you know, cowboy and ice and all, and several things you came up with, but you don't really consider what you're writing today science fiction. Do you have a genre term for it?
Oh, I think it's, you know, I've never considered it to be not science fiction, but neither, like, you know, when I wrote Neuromancer and a couple of short stories that led up to it, I had never heard the term cyberpunk. When you know, when Terry Carr commissioned Neuromancer for his first novels series, he had never heard of it. It wasn't even really a twinkle in anyone's eye. But by the time I wrote Neuromancer, I had met Bruce Sterling, John Shirley, and a couple of other writers who had whose attitude toward the genre was closer to my own, you know, as a young adult than to my sense of what the, you know, my 13-year-old sense of what science fiction had been, which is when I first discovered it. But you know, so I discovered science fiction at 13. So I'm really like a native of the genre. But by the time I was 15, 16, all I was into as far as science fiction went was British New Wave and its American equivalent. So I was, you know, I was into Ballard and Moorcock and all those guys and Samuel Delaney, who I considered to be kind of an American version, and Tom Dish, and like Heinlein and Bradbury I had sort of left that behind. And actually, really, I never went back to it. And but also when I started to write, one of the things that makes the cyberpunk label feel kind of ironic to me is that by the time I started to learn to write, I'd gotten a bachelor's degree in honors English literature at the University of British Columbia. So I sort of knew, I knew in an analytical way, excuse me, I knew in an analytical way what the science fiction I'd first read hadn't been giving me. And I could see that the British New Wave had been giving me more of that. But when I looked at science fiction, like in 77 or so, the science fiction that was being written, it seemed to me like, you know, the old guys had won. And so I wanted to do something that made sense to the part of me that had loved the British New Wave, but, you know, do do it as an American living in Canada.
Well, when I was a kid, I certainly absorbed most of Moorcock, and I still remember reading the dances at the end of time and some of his trippier stuff. And I didn't love all of it, but it sure made you think about stuff in a different way. So
Yeah.
have you ever fallen guilty to the disease a lot of the writers seem to be, what I used to dub it, sadly, Heinlein disease, that they would come up with I will now unify all of my books into one grand central timeline and universe. Have you ever felt like doing that?
No, and it wouldn't be possible.
I don't think
I
so,
mean,
but you'd be surprised who tries.
Well, I've seen people I've seen people make the case that the nearer future of the bridge books is the past of Neuromancer, but it's nonsense. Like the contents of the books don't bear it out. And when I wrote the bridge books, starting with Virtual Light, one thing I was really consciously doing, I don't know, I didn't make a big deal of it, but I was trying to write a kind of SF that took what people had by then what people by then were calling cyberpunk. It took that for granted and handled it in an almost satirical way. Like there, from, what do you call it, the Sprawl trilogy, I never called it that. And I never called the bridge books that either, but people who've read all my stuff know what I mean. And then the Big End universe from pattern recognition on, those are really, really different kinds of fiction. If you're, if you really know, I think if you really know fiction, you know what I mean. And so sorry, it's been a long day. The peripheral, I really thought, okay, I won't do this. This is going to be this is a thing unto itself. And then I'm going to write something set in the present, but more or less the present, the way Virtual Light say. No, yeah, never mind. I'm rambling hopelessly, but ask
It's
me
okay.
something fresh.
How about a sequel to the Difference Engine? Ever
Well,
had any thoughts of that, in Bruce?
Well, we talked at one point. He had an idea. He had an idea for a book in which someone else, it would have been a kind of 1940s alternate reality where something else had happened to get them up to speed digitally. So it wasn't set in the future of the Difference Engine. But I don't know. I had too many. I had like just too much on my plate at that point to do it, and so he wanted to do something and moved on and wrote his own novel. Although he's never written that one.
Yeah, I haven't seen much from Bruce in a while, but I haven't seen Bruce in years either. That's too bad, but he could put more little tidbits in the side of his novels than most people could write in the main thread. I always was amazed at stuff he would just toss off, as little bits and pieces.
I know, and he's one of those people. If I hadn't have met him, I would have written the kind of stuff that I wrote after meeting him. In some ways, he raised the bar for me, and I'm like, this guy can seriously make shit up, and just off the top of his head, it's like brilliant stuff.
Have you ever gotten to a point in these books that link and you suddenly go, oh crap, I shouldn't have done X? Because I remember talking to Richard Morgan once, and he was really sad when he was doing book 3 that he'd started his sort of neo-socialist philosophy and throwing little tidbits at the start of every chapter in the first book or two. And then he got to book 3, they go back to the hero's homeworld, and he's like, oh crap, I've got to make this all into a unified field theory now of this socialist.
Well,
Have you ever had anything with like you've gone and, oh, I should have done this back there, and you can't really go back and change it if you're already on the next book?
No, yeah, and particularly with these 3 books, because they have to be, to satisfy me, it's going to have to be like a unified cycle, at least. And so I tried very hard writing Agency to leave enough slack that I wouldn't be caught up that way. But just in terms of what happens in a book, what happens to the characters over the course of one of my books, in a way, I feel like I don't actually have much control over it. Like the thing that makes it up as I go along isn't the part of me that's talking to you. It's some part of me that, I wish I could get it. I wish I had some surefire way of getting it to show up when I need it. Because sometimes I'll just like hit a wall and have to, go and do something else, but preferably some form of engrossing manual labor, and just let the circuits cool down and then go back and start up again. But I don't, like I never have, by the end of the book, I've got a kind of chart and filing cards and arrows and that sort of thing. But that's all built after the fact. But very frequently in the course of writing a book, I'll have to double back and change something, and in order to match up with some better idea. And when Bruce and I were writing The Difference Engine, he called that chore of going back and changing something. What did he call it? Shit. I am losing it. Oh, doing the backfill. He'd say, okay, I'm going to go back and do the backfill on chapter 17. You go up to the working face. That was like the last written page, and see how far you can move it ahead while I do this backfill. And then he would come back to whatever I had done and rewrite that. And it's kind of a useful concept.
Now, I know writers who say things in the manuscript will say things like fight scene here, and they'll go back and write it, the whole thing later, especially if they're dealing with really our artistic, authentic, fantasy weaponry. I was curious, Neuromancer came out of a manual typewriter, right?
Yeah.
So do you think the change in technology, are you fully into it's all digital, and has it affected how you write and what you produce, and in what ways do you think?
Well, it's totally, I'm sure, as far as I can tell, it's facilitated it. And I kind of owe that to Bruce too, because I was still working on the manual typewriter. And one day he called me up and he said, my father gave me this thing, and it's going to change your life. And I said, what is it? And he said, it's called a word processor. And it's a piece of software that I got running on this Apple computer that my father gave me because he just got a more up-to-date one, and it's just gonna change everything. It's like your whole experience of writing is going to be hugely freed up. And I really found that to be true. One thing for me is like I've never learned to type properly, so I'm a terrible, bad hunt and peck typist to this day. Although somehow I can do it quite quickly now because I've done it so much. But my manuscripts used to be topographical with whiteout over whiteout over whiteout. Then I started using the little white pieces of adhesive paper that restaurant owners use to correct their menus. And I don't know, I haven't looked at those manuscripts for a long time, but I kind of think that if anybody unpacks them, they're just gonna fall apart, like all the glued on correction. And that vanished with word processing.
I think about the technology in the sense of, I think it was actually one of Bruce's books. They talked about a guy who was an information specialist, and his job was to go back through all the myriad layers of software and word processors and devices and try and make this stuff actually readable in the archives.
Yeah.
So we might be heading that way, where they go, oh, I've got this little Apple One, and like, well, no one knows how to read that or turn that thing or boot it up. It could be a real problem next 10, 20 years, and people all start donating stuff to libraries and universities. And
Oh yeah, it's definitely going to be that's going to be a thing. I suspect though that eventually you'll be able to buy probably not that portable gizmo that just does that. Something that's got every kind of port and diskette slot that you're likely to run into. Like I was putting together my archives, so-called, to donate them to university lately. And I found a couple of things in form, like digital information on formats I didn't even recognize. I guess they were little things that I had skipped, or like mini CD like things that so quickly. So quick. It all changed so quickly. But I bet there'll be some kind of big kind of workbench type device that's sort of the size of a really large boom box that just has it's all slots and fronts, and it's got something to play laser discs on. And if you're a research librarian, you'd have one of those right beside your desk. Because it's a limited. Surely there were a limited number of those formats, but yeah, it's going to be tricky. And I think a lot of it will just, have decayed. Like it's not terribly permanent, that stuff.
I've got somewhere a box of 8-tracks. If I ever get a machine to play them, and I'm not sure what they're going to sound like, might not be too good. And there's all sorts of. I still have some floppies somewhere in a box somewhere. You kind of answered the question earlier, but how did the current state of affairs politically affect life in Canada? I mean, because in the U.S. we've been a big mess, and the Canadians probably think we're all crazy. I was wondering how different it looks up there than down here, a couple hundred miles away.
Well, I'm not Canadian. I'm not Canadian by birth.
Right.
And Canada, interestingly, one of the things I loved about Canada from the very start is that Canada didn't seem to have the part of nationalism that would expect immigrants to become Canadian, like to take on all of the cultural trappings of someone born here, and so you there's the option of well, I've lived here for 30 years. I really never lived anywhere else, and I love my life here, but I never think of myself as Canadian. I think of myself as a incredibly fortunate guy from southwestern Virginia, really, and who got lucky in a number of ways. One of them was living here, but people. So I hesitate to theorize about just the Canadian sense of what America is at the best of times, but yeah. So, but people,
Okay.
people up here, it took them 3 weeks to start to get freaked out after the election. Like I was like a basket case for those 3 weeks, and friends of mine were like, "Are you okay?" And I'm going, "No, this is gonna be bad." And they didn't have the wiring to get it. But then they started to see the dude more, and at least almost everyone I know got it. I know to speak to a couple of people who are still big fans, who became big fans and still seem to be.
Well, I won't put myself in that book. I never thought it could happen, and it's just been a very, very strange 4 years. I'm kind of curious how many folks will actually write books set in this era in the near future, or they might just want to try and forget it never happened. You think it'll be
Oh,
a big trend like World War II books, or is this going to be like we're going to just pretend those 4 or 5 years just didn't exist?
well, periods like years are like that's a human cultural thing, and so history, like the movement of history doesn't really divide itself that well, and there were so much stuff foreshadowing what happened with in Trump's presidency. And it goes back, you can easily go back to the Civil War and just afterward. I mean, there's some of the stuff that allows the problems that allow the Trumps of the world to operate often tend to be very old. They've never really been addressed. And I think that's what was happening now. But I don't think a lot of Canadians must have been appalled by it all, I'm sure. But we have, there are Canadian white supremacists. I mean, we've got a little bit of everything. The local, whatever local equivalent of Proud Boys would be unlikely to be up to their necks in AR-15s, though, which is something I really appreciate about this culture.
I'm going to take a look at the Q&A folder, and there's at least a couple in there, and see if we have something we should ask you from them. Hang on a second here. Let me see if I can make this work. Someone wants to know, if you started out writing a Civil War novel, would it be straightforward historical or be an alternate history, like someone like S.M. Sterling would do or something?
I don't know. I haven't given it much. I haven't given it much thought, but I mean, when I think of it, when I think of what it could be like, I think about I'm not saying I could ever do anything so great, but I think about Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which is straight historical, but feels like science fiction to me, or fantasy or something. Like it has this absolutely surreal tone that I've never seen applied to historical fiction before. And at the same time, he's managed to envision what it was like to be alive then, as vividly as I've ever seen it. I've ever seen it done. So it could be. I mean, it's the kind of. I'm imagining the kind of book that I'd like it if somebody else wrote it. I feel I could just buy it and read it. I don't know that I'll ever really. I'll ever really try to do it. But yeah, it's in the hopper. Maybe the graphic novel. That would be something.
You might find out those are more work than writing the novel. I've talked to a few authors about those easy graphic novel adaptations they get mired in. Another question here says, are you aware of fellow Vancouverite Claire Ocher Grimes? I'm not sure I'm saying this right. It says, a big fan of yours, seems increasingly like a William Gibson character. She has a Miss Anthropocene in her pending album. I'm not sure. Apparently she's a singer, has a track titled Idoru.
Yeah, well, she is also Elon Musk's baby mama.
Oh.
Yeah, no
Didn't know
kidding.
that.
And she went to high school she went to high school at the same time the son of a friend of mine went to high school. I didn't, I don't know that they would ever have known each other, but and we had our son earlier in a parent participation daycare. So while I was there, so that our daughter was there, the friend's son was there too. So I knew this guy since he's like, in day school, and he's the same age. He's the same age as that woman, and like that's one of the weird things that happens to you when you get really old.
Your kids ever experienced the moment? I remember when I was a kid, there was the article about how Paul McCartney's son apparently came home one day and said, "My God, you're Paul McCartney!" Like he finally realized his dad was one of the Beatles. And he's really famous. Your kids ever have that moment, like you're William Gibson, or they just go, "Oh, it's Dad"?
No, it's Dad. It's poor Dad with his boring job. He sits in the basement and types.
Well, I suppose that's what kids are for. They keep you grounded.
Yeah.
If anyone else on their group has a question, now would be a good time to ask it before we run out of time. I decided to throw it out there because I asked the two that were sitting in the file I could see. Anybody else has a question? Shoot it our way now, okay? I'm thinking what else I haven't asked that would sound valid here. You've answered quite a bit of it. If you assume you don't write the Civil War novel and you finish this third of the trilogy, do you know where you're going to go next? Do you have an idea yet, or are you just sort of going to wait till the muse hits you?
Oh, well, I have to see what I kind of have to see what the world is doing. And it takes me every time I finish one of these 3-book movements, and that's like a long period of time, okay, it takes me like almost 10 years, I think. And it's gradually taking longer. I have to find some way to refresh my sense of how weird the world actually is. Because what I'm trying to do, and instinctively, I think what I try to do in my fiction is write something that's of the world we live in, but a little bit weirder. And I think it's like I'm intuitively trying to induce just the right degree, the pleasurable degree of cognitive dissonance, not have the reader completely swamped and unable to figure out what's going on, but just to, kind of weird the reader out in what for some readers would be an enjoyable way. But in order to do that, I have to be able to have found what a character what a character in one of my books calls the fuckedness quotient. And like, or the FQ. And the FQ has been off the chart now for at least 4 years. So, I have no idea what's on the other side of it. Maybe I
I got a
should.
couple. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Got a couple new questions. One of them says, your work always seems to have well fleshed out worlds to live in. I'm curious about your world building process.
It's it's incremental, and so it's not like I sit down and do a world building marathon. I don't do anything like that at all. I just go along writing my little story and allowing things to accumulate in it. And that was what I did, when I was writing my very first short story. I found, I could describe objects clearly enough, but not just the idea of narrative, but like how to get a character from the ground floor to the third floor. Like, how do you get them up there and move them around physically? Like, I just had no way to do it. So I'd wind up sort of inadvertently making these strings of weird, interesting objects. And then I started to find that they suggested narrative. And I think I learned, and I pretty much had it going on by the time I wrote Neuromancer. I learned to trust that collaging of different bits and pieces as something that would allow me to generate a narrative. Like there's the in Count Zero, the all-seeing AI that the audience met in Neuromancer is hanging out in an abandoned space station, building collage sculptures out of all this glorious junk that has been left there by the billionaire family that abandoned the place. And I think in a way that was sort of consciously a metaphor for how, what passes from my process of world building.
Okay. Another question. Someone wants to know who are the new authors whose work you admire that are publishing or writing today.
Oh man, one of the painful things, one of the really painful things for me about writing is that when I'm actually writing, I'm unable to read. When I'm writing fiction, I'm unable to read fiction. And so that's gotten, and I think it's because it uses the same parts of the brain in some ways. So I really haven't been keeping up with science fiction as much as I should. And I have a terrible memory for names. I'll tell you this is just one name I kind of pull out of the hat, but Harry Kunzru, do you know his HARIKUNZU?
I don't know offhand. I'm sorry. Maybe someone else will pop up with that.
Well, yeah, I'm blanking on his
Okay.
wonderful.
Well, think about it, man. I've got
book.
another question. Maybe why you
Also,
maybe...
Gary Steingart is, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Another one of your fans says that the women protagonists in the Peripheral and Agency are very cool technologists, and she's wondering where you draw their experiences from, asking as a woman in tech.
It's not, it's I'm not really, I'm barely technologically literate, particularly when it comes to digital things. And I've always worked more from the poetics of the technology world. But in the course of doing that, I frequently met and was struck very much by the coolness of a lot of women in technology, and also the extent to which I don't think they get recognized as quickly or as well. And that was one of I had a sort of a short grocery list when I started writing Neuromancer, and one of the things was to have strong, cool female characters, and there were fewer of them around in those days, and I wanted more.
It's always a good thing. So I remember once talking to Greg Bear, and he was now the pipeline for a few guys who would call up someone looking to answer their science questions, because Asimov had passed away and a couple other guys. Do you vet your books through particular people when you want to make sure that the technology is accurate? You haven't guessed wrong about what we already have versus what we can leap into?
Well, yeah, not just with technology. Like I have a short list of people I'd go to. I mean, lots of questions I would take to Cory Doctorow. Questions about the real digital world, I'd probably take to Cory, and you might refer me somewhere else. If it's biology, I'd ask my friend, the novelist Paul Macaulay in London, because he has a doctorate in biology, and he was a research biologist. But then I get, things about, I have a couple of friends who are bureaucrats, and if I have questions about bureaucracy, I ask them.
Those are the scary ones. Do you have anything else you want to talk about or address? Because we're going to run out of time, I think, pretty quick here.
No, I'm kind of, now that I've got my voice back, but I think this is, I think this is good. And thank you for having me here. And thanks to everyone who turned out visually.
All right. Well, thanks, William, for coming along. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you in the not too distant future. Thanks to your publicist and publisher for helping us out here. And thank to all you for coming along and asking some questions I hadn't thought of. Everybody have a good
Okay.
night, and
Good
we'll start
seeing you
closing it
again.
down here.
All righty.